the last video I put up was a look at a real antique fencing musket dating from the First World War. Well, it just so happens another antique has fallen into my lap. This one being exactly the sort of thing you need to know about if you are studying any of the manuals in that book. It is a Highland Broadsword, Napoleonic era sort of thing that was made for officers and NCOs in Highland regiments. And since it's here, I thought it would be super cool to have a look at it. So here is the antique Highland Broadsword. It's Napoleonic, so probably end of the 18th century. It's a standard regulation 33-inch blade mounted on a steel basket. The basket is relatively thin in terms of the amount of steel that's in it compared to the sort of over-engineered reproductions that we tend to work with these days. There's no existing liner in it, though there probably would have been historically. The fit is tight. Okay, I can get my hand in there comfortably with a thin leather glove, but I wouldn't want to wear anything thicker than that inside it, and that of course is without the aforementioned liner. There is just enough room in the handle for me to shift to a handshake grip for cutting purposes. The hilt doesn't get in the way of wrist movement at all, and partly that is because of the pommel. In a lot of reproduction broadswords, they make these little cap pommels extend up above the grip, which means they dig into your wrist, which is wrong. Okay, they need to be flush with the handle like this one so that it doesn't get in the way. However, I cannot extend my hand any further than that, so this is not a sword that is suitable for a thrusting grip. The grip itself is plain wood with a little bit of a carving in there, no hint of any sort of leather or wire covering, though there might have been wire in that groove at some point. And the grip is relatively square, actually. It's not more square than rectangular. Certainly not round. You can definitely tell where the sides are and where the edge is. And reasonably thick, but not uncomfortably so. I think that's quite a nice grip. But the hand is very, very snug in there, okay? So quite a snug fit, again, compared to the oversized things that people tend to get these days. But the small size, of course, helps to keep the weight down as well as the thinness of the steel. It has sword catchers, so-called. There is some debate on the intent and usefulness of these things. Personally, I hate them because I find people's swords keep getting stuck in them and then I can't riposte, which really kind of annoys me. So they're not universally popular, they're not found on all broadswords, but this one has some. The blade, and the blade is really where the action is. So first of all, the blade is German. We know that because it has a Solingen inscription on it, which I will run past the camera in the hope that it might be able to be read. The blade itself is very thin. Okay, so down here at the forte, it's maybe 5 mil thick, right down where it meets the basket, but it shaves down very rapidly. So even by about this point here, it's down to about 3 mil, and then gets thinner all the way up the blade until you can see it's just a razor up this end of the blade. It's incredibly thin and wobbly. Okay, it wobbles. This blade will bends in the air as you maneuver it around, which is quite. I've held a 13th century Scottish medieval sword that did exactly the same thing, and a 16th century sort of clan manufactured broadsword that did exactly the same thing. So the blade profile is very typical Scottish broadsword with this very, very thin wobbly blade. The point of percussion is about 1/3 of the way down the blade where you'd expect it to be. The point, well, it's got kind of a point, but honestly it's a bit spoon-like. It's not really designed for thrusting, this sword. The grip doesn't lend itself to thrusting, and the blade doesn't lend itself to thrusting, and the point doesn't really lend itself to thrusting, so it's not much of a thrusting sword, but it's a great cutting sword, really good for slicing. It is absolutely a broadsword in that the blade is totally symmetrical. It's the same on either side. You can't tell which way it's supposed to be, upside down. It weighs a little over 900 grams, which is very light, okay? I have played with a number of these things over the decades. This is definitely on the lighter side, but weight itself, of course, is not the be-all and end-all. Balance and just general feel in the hand and distal taper make a much bigger difference to the wieldability of the sword than just the weight. But nonetheless, it is very light. For comparison, I've also dug out my sort of bog standard mid-19th century military sword, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. These things are fairly common, so a lot of people have them hanging around the house. And just interesting to look at the differences between this and the broadsword. So first of all, the blade profile is completely different. This is a really, really thick black, and it doesn't really thin down till way up here at the sort of last quarter of the blade. It's got, and then it thins down into a proper cutting blade. It's got quite a deep fuller, and then a sort of chiseled edge on the end, but it's not going to be nearly as good as cutting as the broadsword, except for the very, very end of the blade. And this, as you can see, I've sharpened this up. This is one of my sharp cutting swords, so I actually use this for cutting. And if you cut up there, it's fine. Any further down and you start to run into difficulties. But it is, of course, much, much stiffer. Up to here, it doesn't flex at all, and so it's going to be a much more effective thrusting weapon, and you can tell by the point being a much more thrust-friendly point. In addition to that, this kind of half-basket grip is a little bit more flexible, shall we say. Okay, obviously I can do a hammer grip if I want to parry things. I can shift it into a handshake grip for cutting, and that's great. But I can also shift it down to a thrusting grip, because I've even got this little textured metal plate, just like on the bayonet there, so that I can stick my thumb along in order to bring the point down in line with my wrist and deliver thrusts. So this is a true cut and thrust sword, or possibly even thrust and cut, one could say, given that giving point was a big part of the 19th century swordsmanship. The hilt does not protect me as much as the basket hilt, okay? But it's got sort of the typical half basket, which is there so it can sit flush against the uniform and not bounce around and get in the way, but protect kind of most of what you need to be protected for. Sure, something can snake around and hit you on the hand, but for practical purposes, they obviously thought that was enough. Another interesting point about this blade is, if I see if I can show you the center of percussion for this one, you can see it's way up here. It's about a quarter of the way down the blade rather than a third of the way. I find that interesting because most swords that I've done this to, it's about a third of the way. That's where kind of you assume it is, and including generally reproductions, whereas because of the blade profile of this, I guess it's further up, which means that your point of percussion, the bit you want to hit people with your cut, is actually further up the blade. That is just an interesting discovery. Now, if we compare these two side by side, although this one is slightly lighter at being just over 800 grams, and this is 100 grams heavier, this feels a little clunkier, a little heavier. There's more weight in front of the hand because of that very thick blade. Okay, it's not unwieldy in any way. It's still a very light sword, but it definitely feels a little bit more like that. Whereas the beautiful broadsword feels lighter. Okay, the weight's all centered around the hand here, and it feels absolutely weightless in the hand. How weightless? Well, let's do a comparison with something that you might be familiar with. So here I have an old Hutton sabre. It doesn't have the original Hanway hilt on, I might add. It has a medieval fight club replacement hilt on it, but as it is, it weighs and feels and balances about the same as the thing it's trying to reproduce. That is a mid-19th century military sword stroke sabre. Okay, that feels good. The broadsword feels lighter. In fact, of all the many, many, many swords I have that I have dug out and had a feel with, the one that feels most like the real broadsword is actually this one. So this is my one of our little Alchem spadroons or shearing swords, which have this very triangular blade which gives you mock distal taper, shall you say. It's a very light sword. It's got quite a small pommel on it. There's not much metal in the hilt, as you can see, and this feels more like the real broadsword than anything else that I have. Okay, this is a really light, fast, maneuverable weapon, and only the Alchem really comes close to feeling like the real thing. So there you are, a quick little look at a real Highland broadsword that is exactly the sort of thing you want to be using if you're using Angelo or Taylor or Mathewson or any of those Napoleonic era manuals. Okay, so let's give you one more beauty pass just so you can admire it from afar.